When Ethiopia announced in 2006 that it would restore thousands of hectares of forest without planting a single tree, the world burst out laughing. A green utopia for the desperate, mocked the Washington Post. They'd be better off moving to the Sahara, said a Brussels official. A German ecologist even wrote an article titled, "Why Ethiopia is Mars on Earth." Everyone knew the truth. This was one of the poorest countries in the world, where the only sound was the death wind, where more than 1,000 people died every day from hunger and related diseases, and where the desert devoured the last green patches like a tank offensive. What are they going to do? Grow trees out of thin air? Experts joked. Talk to stumps? Maybe they're friends with the sand too, others chimed in. CNN aired segments about crazy African plans to revive stones. BBC made documentaries on how poverty leads to hallucinations. And these people claimed, "We'll grow a forest by speaking to dead stumps." It looked like desperation had finally driven them mad. But 10 years later, the same world stood in stunned silence. Because in the place where NASA satellites once saw only a brown scar of death, a real forest had grown. Green, alive, breathing. A forest no one had planted. This isn't a story about survival. This is a story of resurrection. Long ago, Ethiopia was paradise on earth. Not metaphorically, literally. The ancients called it the Garden of Eden, and they had good reason. Imagine, 2/3 of the country, an area larger than France, was covered in forests denser than the Amazon. Roman legionaries wrote home about mountains green to the clouds. Travelers told tales of jungles so thick the midday sun couldn't reach the ground. Lions roared from thickets 3 kilometers above sea level, where today there are only rocks and bones. Elephant herds carved paths between 1,000-year-old baobabs. Waterfalls with a taste of honey crashed down from skyscraper heights, their rumble heard for miles. Leopards hunted in tree canopies older than Roman aqueducts. Women had never known drought. Springs gushed year-round from every crevice. Children splashed in streams that never dried, catching fish with their bare hands in crystal pools. Elders sat in the shade of trees older than the pyramids, telling stories to the symphony of 1,000 birds. Bees built hives the size of houses. But little by little, paradise began dying at the hands of the people themselves. The catastrophe crept in like an avalanche in slow motion, slow but unstoppable. First they cut trees near roads, easy to transport. Then it was the mountain slopes. Then the sacred groves, once protected as holy ground, where leaders were buried and ancestors worshipped. Each morning, the mountains woke to the howl of chainsaws. Thousands of people marched out with axes, waging war against nature itself. 500-year-old patriarch trees fell in hours. The earth trembled like in an earthquake. Trucks loaded with tree giants moved in endless funeral processions to cities, where the wood became furniture for the rich. In a single generation, forests that seen the Queen of Sheba vanished. By the mid-20th century, Ethiopia had lost half its greenery. By 1982, only 3% of forest cover remained across the entire country, even less than in the Sahara. Without trees, the land became a sieve. Rain, instead of nourishing roots, poured down in torrents, washing away the last crumbs of fertility to the ocean. Rivers that had flowed since the age of dinosaurs turned into dry stone scars within a decade. Winds raised dust clouds visible from space. Ethiopia became a grotesque brown wound on Africa's green map. Temperatures soared by 3 degrees. The rainy season shrank from 6 months to just 1. Lakes that had existed for millions of years began to dry up, leaving only salty wastelands. Animals fled or died horrific deaths. Birds stopped returning in spring. The Great Silence began. A haunting, dead silence where once the orchestra of life played. The world remembered Ethiopia through searing images of horror. The 1980s, skeletal children with eyes like saucers reflecting only emptiness. Mothers turned into walking shadows, cradling babies that looked like hatchlings. Kilometer-long food lines under the merciless sun. Mothers carried their dead infants for hundreds of kilometers to bury them in the soil that gave them life. Villages turned into ghost towns within weeks. People simply left and never came back. Farmers found their cows mummified near dry wells, bones bleached white by the sun like grim warning signs. At the height of the famine, the land claimed thousands of lives per day. In just 3 years, hunger devoured a population the size of Munich. International journalists flew in to film the African hell, then returned to their cozy studios to show the world this horror. But this wasn't a random disaster. It was a sentence, handed down by the earth itself after decades of ecological cruelty. The insane deforestation had turned the country into a lunar wasteland. Ethiopia was losing 1 billion tons of fertile soil every year, more than the total weight of the Netherlands. Winds scattered it across the planet, from Amazon jungles to Antarctic glaciers, like the ashes of a fallen green paradise. At the height of the famine, the land claimed thousands of lives per day. In just 3 years, hunger devoured a population the size of Munich. International journalists flew in to film the African hell, then returned to their cozy studios to show the world this horror. But this wasn't a random disaster. It was a sentence, handed down by the earth itself. After decades of ecological cruelty, the insane deforestation had turned the country into a lunar wasteland. Ethiopia was losing 1 billion tons of fertile soil every year, more than the total weight of the Netherlands. Winds scattered it across the planet, from Amazon jungles to Antarctic glaciers, like the ashes of a fallen green paradise. The delicate balance of the ecosystem collapsed like a house of cards. Rain stopped falling where it had nourished land for thousands of years. Streams became cracks, wounds torn into the earth. Harvests wilted before they could ripen. Farmers who had lived off this land for generations could now gather only a month's worth of grain instead of a year's. The desert advanced like a military blitzkrieg, 50,000 hectares per year. In highlands once echoing with leaves, now howled sandstorms. Farmers abandoned the fields of their ancestors, leaving only their graves behind. Cattle died of thirst, their snouts buried in the cracked clay of former ponds. The government began evacuating entire provinces. Roads swarmed with refugee caravans, half-alive souls trudging into nowhere with bundles on their backs. International experts delivered a harsh verdict. By the year 2000, Ethiopia would become an uninhabitable desert. It seemed the land had forgotten what it meant to be alive. The first attempts at salvation failed on a cosmic scale. Billions in international aid vanished into the sand. Well-meaning Europeans brought saplings from their nurseries, but they withered and died in a week under the African sun. They built concrete dams, washed away by the first rains. They dug wells with German precision, dried up in a month. Armies of global experts arrived in white jeeps, studied everything, and delivered the same verdict. The land is dead, forever. A professor from Heidelberg once wrote an article titled, "Why Ethiopia is Mars on Earth," and even won a prestigious science award for it. So when, in 2006, Ethiopian authorities announced their incredible plan to restore forests without planting a single tree. The world reacted as if someone had proposed flying to the moon in a hot air balloon. "A green utopia for desperate minds," wrote the Washington Post. "An African fantasy on the edge of madness," echoed The Guardian. "Are they planning to sing lullabies to the sand?" sneered a French scientist at a Sorbonne conference. CNN ran segments on crazy plans to revive stones through prayer. BBC filmed documentaries about how extreme poverty leads to hallucinations. "They think they can talk to dead stumps," scoffed academics in tweed jackets. The world believed a simple truth: nothing ever grows in the desert, period. But luckily, the land turned out to be smarter than humans. In 1983, in the scorched desert of distant Niger, a discovery was made that changed everything. Tony Rinaldo, an Australian agronomist, was a young dreamer determined to stop the spread of desertification in the vast Sahel, the dry zone between the Sahara and the African savanna. He arrived in Africa like a knight on a white horse, ready to take on the ruthless desert almost single-handedly. For years, he planted trees with the obsession of a fanatic. His organization poured millions into saplings, fertilizers, irrigation systems. Every year, they planted 6,000 trees. Every year, 5,500 of them died. Locals called him the crazy white farmer. Children giggled watching him water dead sticks in 55 degrees Celsius heat, talking to them like they were children. The desert was merciless and mocking. Hurricane-force winds uprooted seedlings like matchsticks. The sun scorched them by day, the sand aeried them by night. Then one day, while changing a flat tire on a dusty road in the middle of a drought, a time when even scorpions were hiding in deep holes, Tony noticed something strange. Growing by the roadside was what he first thought was a weed. Out of professional curiosity, he leaned closer and froze. It was the stump of an old tree, alive, with roots struggling to grow. From what looked like a dead trunk, dozens of tiny green shoots were emerging, like the fingers of a drowning person reaching toward the light. A silent cry for help echoing across time. In that moment, something clicked in Tony's mind. He realized he'd been solving the wrong problem all along. It wasn't about planting new trees. It was about finding a way to wake the old ones. Beneath the sand and ash, the root systems of trees cut down decades ago were still alive. They reached over 30 meters deep, down to underground water untouched by drought. They were waiting. They remembered how to be a forest. They were asleep, but not dead. That's how FMNR was born. Farmer-managed natural regeneration. The secret was almost laughably simple. When a stump puts out dozens of weak shoots, you leave only 3 or 4 of the strongest ones. Then, all the energy of the ancient root system focuses on them, instead of being wasted on dozens of useless sprouts. The result: a shoot grows several centimeters a month. Within a year, it becomes a small tree the size of a human. In 3 years, full canopy. Since 1983, a small experiment with 10 farmers in Niger began slowly gaining momentum. By the early 2000s, the method had spread across hundreds of thousands of hectares, a solid result for the dry Sahel. Tree density increased from 4 trees per hectare to 20. Millet and sorghum yields grew by almost 20%. Shrubs appeared, new trees, livestock feed. Locals were happy. Children stopped going hungry during the dry season, and women spent less time searching for firewood. But it was just a drop in the ocean of the Sahel. By 2005, the U.S. Geological Survey recorded vegetation recovery on about 3 million hectares. An impressive number, but still a tiny fraction of the 200 million hectare Sahel. Most experts considered Niger's experience a localized success, impossible to scale. Tony Rinaldo and his team understood the harsh reality. It's one thing to try this in Niger, with its relatively mild 500 millimeters of annual rainfall. But Ethiopia was a different beast entirely. In Niger, at least it occasionally drizzled, keeping the soil somewhat moist. In Ethiopia, the ground was hard as asphalt. Temperatures often soared to 50 degrees Celsius. Humidity, less than 10%. Winds blew like hurricanes, drying out any greenery in hours. Still, in 2006, Ethiopia decided to try the crazy Niger idea across the entire country. The world erupted in laughter. If it took Niger 23 years to recover just a few miserable percent of desert, wrote Nature, what could possibly be done in the hell of Ethiopia? The difference in climate is colossal, like comparing a greenhouse to the surface of Mars, said climatologists at MIT. At least Niger has a rainy season. Ethiopia only has a death season, mocked a French ecologist at a conference in Paris. Then, in the famine-stricken region of Humbo, suffering for 30 years. Rumors spread about the crazy white farmer from Niger and his magical method. 7 communities decided to try Tony Renado's idea. They had no choice, only death by starvation or a miracle. Humbo was called a lunar landscape. The hills were as bare as a newborn's skull. Not a single tree on the horizon, just rocks and dust stretching into the sky. The soil was like concrete. You could split it with an axe. Children knew no shade, except the shadow of their crumbling homes. Women walked 15 kilometers a day for water, returning under the stars after the heat subsided. The people embraced FMNR with the desperation of the condemned. They fenced off the deadest plots with barbed wire, stopped chopping what looked like weeds, began cutting weak shoots with sharp knives, nurturing the strong ones like their own children. They protected young growth from goats and livestock that devoured any green, and they waited, praying to all their gods. For weeks, nothing happened. The land was silent. Many began to doubt. Maybe the experts were right. Maybe they really were crazy. But the elders insisted. Be patient. The land has slept for 30 years. Give it time to wake up. And then, after 3 months, a miracle. The first results appeared like a heavenly gift. Tiny green dots on a brown canvas of death, like stars in the night sky. Children ran from bush to bush, counting every new sprout. Women wept with joy, kissing the first little leaves. 6 months later, bushes up to the waist. A year later, young saplings rustled in the wind. And after 3 years, people couldn't recognize their homeland. Where there was once desert, young trees now swayed in the breeze. NASA captured a true phenomenon from space. A green patch growing in the middle of the desert at a rate of 10 hectares per month. Scientists double and triple checked the data. They had never seen anything like it. Satellites don't lie. By 2020, the Humbo forest had absorbed nearly 3 million tons of CO2, more than a small European country emits in a year. The project became the first in Africa to sell carbon credits on the global market. The communities earned $500,000 from it, more money than they had ever seen in their history. Yields soared. Farmers who used to harvest 3 sacks of grain per field were now collecting 15 from the same land. New income sources appeared: wild honey from bees that returned from nowhere, medicinal herbs, building materials, fodder for animals. People who had spent their lives just trying to survive began for the first time to plan a future for their children. But the most astonishing transformation came with water. In the mountains surrounding Humbo, there had once been 13 natural springs. All of them dried up in the 1980s. Elders remembered them as places of childhood games and women's conversations, where girls learned to braid hair and boys caught frogs. For 30 years, they were just dusty pits overgrown with thorn bushes. Geologists declared them dead forever, The aquifers, they said, had been irreversibly depleted. But the trees knew more than the geologists. As FMNR worked its magic above ground, something miraculous was happening below. The soil beneath the new canopies turned into a sponge. Rain no longer ran off in torrents, washing away precious nutrients into distant seas. It began to seep down, deeper and deeper, quietly reviving water tables that had been sleeping for decades. Then the springs began to return. At first, tiny trickles after rain, gone in an hour. Then they lasted longer. Then a day. Then a week. Then they didn't stop, even during the harshest dry seasons. The water was cold and clear, like the tears of joy shed by the earth itself. Today, 6 of the 13 springs flow year-round with the force of geysers. Their gurgling can be heard from a kilometer away, a true song of the resurrected land. Children who had never seen running water now splash in the streams, learning to swim in shallow pools. Women who used to trek half a day across rocky paths for water now fill their buckets 5 minutes from home. No wells were dug, no pumps installed, no pipes laid. People simply gave nature a chance to remember what it means to live. 10 years later, the BBC returned to Humbo to film the sequel. The crew got lost on the very first day. The cameraman turned in disbelief. The place he remembered as a lunar crater had become a jungle. GPS showed the right coordinates, but their eyes refused to believe what they saw. Where once the land stretched barren to the horizon, now you couldn't see more than 10 meters ahead through the thick greenery. Instead of wind whistling through rocks, there was a symphony of birds and rustling leaves. Children born after the project began don't believe their parents' stories about the desert. They know only the shade of trees, the songs of birds, the murmur of streams. When shown old photographs, they think they're looking at images from Mars. How could anyone live in that hell, they ask. Experts quietly rewrote their textbooks. Universities that once mocked FMNR as witchcraft opened departments of natural regeneration. Professors from Harvard and Oxford lined up to study the primitive techniques of African farmers. This story of Humbo spread through Africa like a virus of hope. FMNR began spreading faster than a pandemic. In West Africa, 15 million hectares of land have been restored. In Mali, 70% of families no longer know hunger. In Kenya, incomes rose by 40%. In Senegal, children are seeing antelopes for the first time in generations. The cost? Almost nothing, $40 per hectare versus $18,000 for traditional reforestation. Survival rate? 90% compared to 20% for imported saplings. Chinese scientists traveled to study this African magic and adapted it to the Gansu Desert. Indians tested it in Rajasthan, Mexicans in Sonora. Brazilians used it to restore the Cerrado. Australian Aboriginal communities are bringing their bush back to life using ancestral knowledge. The World Economic Forum launched the Trillion Tree Campaign. The UN declared 2021 to 2030 the decade on ecosystem restoration. And FMNR became a cornerstone technology for saving the planet. Tony Rinaldo received the Alternative Nobel Prize. At Davos, people listened to him like a prophet. His book, The Forest Underground, was translated into 20 languages. The man once called the crazy farmer is now known as the man who whispers to forests. NASA confirmed the miracle. Despite the devastating deforestation of the Amazon, Earth's overall green cover is growing, and Africa is leading the way. In 15 years, Ethiopia restored more forest than the size of Belgium. A country that once lost 1 million hectares a year now restores 500,000. It's the fastest ecosystem recovery in recorded history. The climate is visibly changing. The rainy season has doubled from 2 months to 4. Temperatures have dropped by 2 degrees. Humidity is up by a third. Birds not seen for 50 years are returning. Eagles, storks, sunbirds. Fatima from Humbo now exports 2 tons of honey a year to Europe, from plants her grandmother thought extinct. Bees believed in the forest's resurrection before people did. She laughs, showing jars of golden honey. Demisu gives tours to delegations from 40 countries, showing the stump where it all began, the gnarled remains of a tree his grandfather cut down in the 1960s. Now a towering giant whose canopy shelters 100 people. My grandfather killed it, I revived it, and my grandson will eat its fruit, he tells every group. 89-year-old elder Abebe sits under the tree each morning and weeps with joy. I thought I'd die before seeing the green hills of my childhood again, but the earth turned out to be more patient and wiser than us. Today, as the planet burns in the fire of climate catastrophe, while experts speak of irreversible damage, the miraculous rebirth of Ethiopia stands as a hymn of hope. If the poorest country on earth could resurrect dead land with bare hands, what could we all achieve together? This movement is now spreading to 27 countries, from Kenya and Mali to India, Australia, and Mexico, from Laos to Argentina. The seeds of an idea planted in the dust of an African village are taking root on every continent. 30 years from now, children will play in these forests. Children who won't believe there was ever a desert here. And when shown photos from 2006, they'll ask, "Why did you wait so long to begin?" Ethiopia didn't plant a single tree. It grew hope for an entire planet. It proved a simple truth. Beneath every desert, a forest sleeps, waiting for someone to help it wake. And if you ever doubt the power of human belief, remember this story. Remember the people who didn't give up, even when the whole world laughed at them. Remember the land, which remembered how to be alive, and waited for those who believed in miracles. And when shown photos from 2006, they'll ask, "Why did you wait so long to begin?" Ethiopia didn't plant a single tree. It grew hope for an entire planet. It proved a simple truth. Beneath every desert, a forest sleeps, waiting for someone to help it wake. And if you ever doubt the power of human belief, remember this story. Remember the people who didn't give up, even when the whole world laughed at them. Remember the land, which remembered how to be alive, and waited for those who believed in miracles. And now look out your window. Maybe beneath your own ground, a forest is sleeping too, waiting only for your faith. If poor Ethiopia could bring the land back to life with bare hands, what's stopping us from saving our own backyard, our own neighborhood, our own country?